On the morning of April 10th, 1881, a letter to the editor from the chief of detectives in Stockholm, Sweden, appeared in the morning edition of the Astorian in Astoria, Oregon.
Sir, excuse my troubling you, unknown as I am, with a private affair, but as I know no other to apply to, and it is of a very serious matter to me, I feel quite sure that you will forgive my boldness, and favor me with what knowledge you have in the matter. My stepson Carl Peterson sailed on board the English ship Lupata, which was wrecked off Tillamook Rock 3rd of January last. I heard of the wreck lately, and wrote to the Secretary of Lloyd's for information, and he gave me what he knew, which, however, was very scanty, and further sent me a letter from the managing owner of the ship. From this I learnt the date of the wreck, and that the whole crew were lost, together with some other particulars, which, however, appeared to have been gathered rather hastily. He told me, moreover, that he had part of this from your paper. As I, however, want to know more about my ill-fated son's end, as you easily can imagine, and my poor wife, the boy's mother, still more wants it, I have thought that you perhaps would be kind and give me the particulars about this unhappy accident you cannot but possess. I therefore beg that you kindly would tell me all that you know about the wreck, the situation of the place, and whether all the bodies, there were 23 on board, have been found. My stepson was 24 years old, with oval face, large nose, and of a goodly shape. For my probably bad American, and for my importunity, I once more beg your excuse. In hope of an answer from you, I sign with greatest respect, your most honorable servant. Per Cederberg, Chief of Detectives, Stockholm, Sweden.
For a ship and her crew to come to their end on America's northwest coast was not an uncommon occurrence in the 19th century. Indeed, this stretch of rocky and often stormy Pacific Northwest coastline is known as the Graveyard of the Pacific for good reason. But what of the Lupata and Carl Peterson? What more could we have told his mother and stepfather of their fate? Per Cederberg already knew the ship was wrecked on the Oregon coast at Tillamook Head on the 3rd of January in 1881. What more is there to know? Owned by a J. H. Clark, the Lupata was an iron-hulled, three-masted bark, built at Williamson's shipyard in Harrington, England in 1875. Her overall length was 215 feet, and she weighed in empty at 1,039 tons. A bark is a three-masted ship with the fore and main mast square-rigged and the aft mast fore and aft rigged. Her home port was London, England. Over the next 5 years, the Lupata would visit ports across much of the globe, including Europe, South America, Australia, Japan, and the west coast of North America. We can follow the travels of the Lupata thanks in part to ship reports relayed by passing ships. These reports might include arrivals in and departures from various ports or even a location at sea that ultimately appeared in newspapers carrying shipping news. Leaving Hamburg on May 9, 1875, she arrived in under 3 months' time in Melbourne, Australia, delivering a cargo of galvanized corrugated iron and barrels of table salt. 3 of the original crew were reported to have deserted in Victoria. By August 21, the Lupata was ready to sail again with stops scheduled in Chile on her way back to London. In late January 1876, the Lupata was making her way north across the equator in the Atlantic. Near the equator, sailing ships encounter the doldrums, that is, an area of frequently calm winds. For ships largely reliant on the wind as a means of propulsion, the doldrums could leave a ship becalmed for weeks.
The doldrums are also known to meteorologists as the Intertropical Convergence Zone. It is here that trade winds out of the northeast in the northern hemisphere meet up with the trade winds in the southern hemisphere blowing out of the southeast. The confluence of the trade winds create rising air, which in turn causes the light winds, while also enhancing thunderstorm activity.
Still on her return trip to Britain on February 8th, the Lupata's crew got a reminder of how risky ship voyages could still be when they passed by a waterlogged and abandoned bark. The fore and main masts of the bark were reported still standing, but a cargo of timber was washing out of her stern. The Lupata completed her first trip to the far side of the world in just over 9 months, arriving in London later that February. Her next voyage, again to the Pacific, departed England in June 1876. Sailing by way of Cape Horn with stops again in Chile, she made her first trip to the Pacific Northwest, arriving in Astoria, Oregon in December. Loaded with wheat, the Lupata was bound for Europe again in January 1877. Her next voyage took a similar route, with stops in Hamburg and Coquimbo, before arriving in Astoria in June of 1878. Captain Irvin brought his newlywed wife, Anne Perry, with him on the trip. After loading salmon, wheat, and flour in Astoria and Portland, the Lupata embarked on another return trip to London. Just a day prior to crossing the equator, Captain Miller Irvin's wife, Anne, gave birth to their first child on board the Lupata. The boy was Christian John Edward Pacific Irvin.
As we watch the return trip unfold through position reports, we can get a sense of how 19th century sailing ships followed the prevailing winds. Sailing with favorable winds might mean taking an indirect route, but could wind up proving to be a faster, easier, and safer alternative. To take advantage of the trade winds, the ship's captain would need to understand how they vary throughout the course of the year.
In late December 1878 and early January 1879, the Lupata met up with heavy gales as she neared the English Channel. In a storm described as a perfect hurricane, the ship was thrown on her side and she had to cut away her main topgallant mast and fore topmast.
In the North Atlantic winter, this would not have been a hurricane in the most commonly used sense of an intense tropical storm. However, in the past especially, the word hurricane could be used to refer to any storm of the most severe intensity, and the North Atlantic in winter can be exceptionally stormy.
Their next voyage to the Pacific met with more bad luck. Working upwind against strong early winter westerlies, 3 able-bodied seamen, John Erickson, John Perry, and Andrew Vidal, all perished. Just a few weeks later, the sailmaker, Frederick Thornberry, was also drowned. While we don't know the circumstances or exact location of these losses, compared with earlier and later known times and positions, it almost certainly suggests a particularly rough passage around Cape Horn. As ships progressed south in the southern hemisphere, winds grew potentially stronger, earning the nicknames of the Roaring 40s south of 40 degrees south and the Furious 50s south of 50 degrees south. East-moving storms and seas south of Cape Horn, at about 56 degrees south, are able to move unimpeded by land. For westbound ships trying to pass the Cape, these storms and seas could make passage of the Cape one of the most trying and difficult passages in the world. A whaler's saying from the 19th century sums up the weather of the far southern waters with, "Beyond 40 degrees south there is no law. Beyond 50 degrees south there is no God." By early August, the Lupata arrived in Valparaiso, Chile, and reported a very stormy voyage. In early October, we find the Lupata in the far South Atlantic on her return trip to the British Isles. And just 11 weeks later, she arrived in Cork Harbour, Ireland. After stops in Hamburg, Amsterdam, and Antwerp, the Lupata set sail for the Far East in April 1880. Approaching the equator in the Atlantic, the Lupata's Captain Miller Irvin died of what was reported to be natural causes on the 9th of June. In Captain Irvin's place, First Mate Benjamin Raven assumed command of the Lupata. Benjamin Henry Raven was born in 1858 in Kilrush, Ireland, the son of a British naval officer. He had been at sea since 1874, having served 4 years as an indentured apprentice in the Merchant Navy on board the ships Lake Ontario and Lake Superior, before being rated second mate in 1879. After serving as second mate on the Dunnerdale, Master Raven qualified as a first mate in April of 1880. The Lupata sailed on. In a little over 3 months' time, she arrived in Yokohama, Japan. On October 1st, a court of inquiry was held in regards to the death of Captain Irvin. It revealed that Captain Irvin had begun to complain of stomach issues shortly after departing Antwerp. After 10 days, it was reported that his mind would periodically become deranged for extended periods, but not enough that First Mate Raven felt like he needed to be relieved of command. Master Raven stated, "He was on deck even to the day of his death, about 4 hours before he died, when he appeared sane. He said, 'I am going to die. You take out the charts, take charge of the vessel, and make the best passage you can. All my personal effects I wish to go to my sister.' He seemed to think that his wife was dead. He never spoke again in my presence." The steward and another witness corroborated the evidence of the master, and it was ruled that Miller Irvin died of natural causes at sea, at 4 degrees 55 minutes north latitude, 24 degrees 15 minutes west longitude. Captain Irvin had resided with his wife Anne and son John in Chester, England. He died at about 32 years of age. On October 23rd, the Lupata departed Yokohama with a stop scheduled in Kobe, Japan, before heading east to the Pacific Northwest coast. January 2, 1881, found the Lupata arriving at the Columbia Gateway off the mouth of the Columbia River. The weather was fine with a moderate southeast breeze, and the Columbia River bar was smooth, ideal conditions for a bar crossing. The mouth of the Columbia in 1881 was a much different place than the mouth of the Columbia in the 21st century. There were no jetties to stabilize safe shipping channels through the entrance to the river. Construction on jetties would not begin until 1885. Instead, the bar consisted of sandy shallows and small islands with narrow shifting channels through which ships could pass. Navigation aids marking the shipping channel at the mouth of the Columbia included 2 lighthouses, the Cape Disappointment Lighthouse on the north side of the river at Fort Canby, and the Point Adams Lighthouse on the south side of the entrance. To guide ships safely across the treacherous river bar, a pilot with an extensive knowledge of the locale would be brought on board. By 1881, the Columbia River bar pilots, licensed by the state of Oregon, had already been operating for 30 years. As darkness approached in the evening of Sunday, January 2nd, the Lupata stood offshore in the company of another English ship, the Devonby, under the command of Captain Remington. The Devonby already had a pilot on board, while the Lupata sat 7 miles offshore waiting for a pilot. The weather thickened overnight as rain moved through and fog settled in. Poor visibility and fog continued through the following day over the water. The Devonby kept a lookout for the Lupata throughout the day on the 3rd, but with the poor visibility, she was nowhere to be found.
Weather records for 1881 in the Pacific Northwest are scarce, but some do exist. The U.S. Army Signal Service, a predecessor to today's National Weather Service, published daily weather maps. On the morning of the 3rd, the weather map showed an observation from Portland, Oregon, about 60 miles inland. The weather observation reported a morning temperature of 39 degrees with a wind out of the south and a relative humidity of 91%. Weather on the coast can differ drastically from that inland. Luckily, we do have other records of the weather for the nearby coast. Fort Canby was located at Cape Disappointment on the south coast of the Washington Territory, while a short distance to the south, Fort Stevens on the North Oregon coast also kept records. Both stations that morning reported cloudy skies with a light wind out of the east or southeast. Winds in those days were reported using the Beaufort scale. The Beaufort scale was developed in the 19th century to relate the strength of the wind with the effects they could be expected to produce. In the case of January 3, 1881, winds were reported as a 1 on the Beaufort scale, or as light air. This would correspond to a speed of just 1 to 3 miles per hour, and if the light air is extended out over the water, might be expected to produce just ripples on the surface of the water. Weather conditions at both stations remain cloudy through the day, with temperatures rising slowly through the 40s. Winds at Fort Canby switch to the southwest and increase slightly, while at Fort Stevens remain light out of the south to southeast.
On the evening of the 3rd, the Lupata reappeared off Tillamook Head, 18 nautical miles south of the Columbia. How or why she was this far south of the Columbia is unknown. We do know that thick weather, in other words, clouds, fog, and rain, likely gave them little if any opportunity to accurately determine their position through either celestial navigation or by using landmarks on the coast. A lack of moonlight made it that much more difficult to see that night. A little more than a year prior, in October of 1879, work had begun on a lighthouse on Tillamook Rock, just a mile offshore of Tillamook Head. By January 3, 1881, the lighthouse was nearing completion, under the supervision of Captain Wheeler, the superintendent of construction. The weather on Tillamook Rock on the evening of Monday, January 3rd, was reported by Captain Wheeler as very thick, with a strong wind blowing from the southeast.
The report of a strong wind blowing from the southeast, while nearby winds reported on the coast as light, may seem odd or even questionable, but they provide an important clue as to what was transpiring with the weather that evening. Often, as a warm front or occluded front approaches the coast or moves northward just off the coast, the winds along the coast ahead of the front may be light out of the east or south. Meanwhile, the winds off the coast, along or on the other side of the front, may be blowing at gale force. Fronts near the Oregon coast can cause such apparent discontinuities in the weather probably a handful times every year, and fits with the weather conditions reported on January 3, 1881.
Regardless of what brought the Lupata to this location, the ship was in a precarious position when the workers heard loud voices that brought them out from their dwellings. What they could make out through the fog was a ship's red light just 200 yards to the southeast. The red light told them they were looking at the port or left side of the ship, moving to the north or northeast. Captain Wheeler told his men to set lanterns in the lighthouse and to build a fire to make the crew aware of their proximity to Tillamook Rock. They were able to hear yelling coming from the ship, but the only words they could make out was the command, "Hard a port." The term port refers to anything to do with the left side of a ship, so you might figure hard a port would mean to turn the ship hard to the left. However, on board a 19th century British sailing ship, the command meant just the opposite, a sharp turn to the starboard or right side. This command stems from the history of the use of a tiller, instead of a wheel, to move the rudder which steers the ship. Because a tiller moves the rudder in the opposite direction, the command hard a port meant to move the tiller to the port side, which turned the ship to the right. In time, hard a port also came to mean to steer the ship to the right. While it seems certain the Lupata's master was unaware of their proximity to the coast initially, seeing the lighthouse in Tillamook Rock must have made him immediately aware of their predicament. They were precariously close to the coast on their starboard side. What the intent of turning hard a port was at this point is pure speculation. It may have been an immediate reaction to steer away from the only visible land, which was the island, or they may have believed an adjustment to the right would allow the ship to sail through the narrow 1-mile-wide passage between Tillamook Rock and Tillamook Head. Another, albeit less likely option, might have been to swing the ship completely around or bring her hard about. Turning to the hard right would ultimately take the wind out of her sails and nearly stop her forward progress. As the ship continued to turn, her bow would face east, then south, and eventually southwest. If she had the room to do this turn, she could then safely sail off again to the southwest, passing to the south side of Tillamook Rock. However unlikely making such a difficult maneuver might seem, it might explain why the ship made what appeared to be such a drastic turn to the right. As the light of the ship disappeared from the view of the men on Tillamook Rock that night, the crew of the Lupata disappeared from sight for the last time. Not long after, and unknown to anyone else at the time, the ship grounded on rocks 200 yards off Tillamook Head and just 1 mile from Tillamook Rock. After more rain overnight, the morning of Tuesday the 4th dawned cloudy and cool on the Oregon coast with a light west wind. The first evidence of the wreck of the Lupata was found washed ashore at Clatsop Beach, where pieces of the wreck, some hard bread, and a chart from the Lupata were found opposite the home of a mail carrier, Mr. Grimes. Captain A.D. Wass did a more thorough search of the same beach that Thursday, finding more evidence of the wreck, including a barrelhead and buckets labeled Lupata. By Sunday, all hope of finding survivors was given up. Mr. Clutry, the seaside mail carrier, found the remains of 12 men in 2 groups on a most forbidding spot on the coast under an almost perpendicular cliff. The bodies found were naked and badly mutilated. There was little noted about their possible identities before being interred. Not in time to save the Lupata, but certainly of benefit to sailors that followed, the Tillamook Lighthouse was lit for the first time with a first-order Fresnel lens just a few weeks later on the 21st of January. Its foghorn became operative in March of 1881. So what more can we tell Par Cedarburg about the fate of his stepson, Carl Peterson? Facts are few, and in the end, there seems little more to tell. Perhaps there would be some consolation in telling Par that when Carl died he was not alone. He perished, along with all 22 of his shipmates, wrecked on a dark, thick night on a lonely, rocky, and forbidding stretch of the North Oregon coast.
Oh, it'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. Oh, we'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. We'd be all right if the wind was in our sails. And we'll all hang on behind, and we'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along, and we'll all hang on behind. Oh, it'd be all right if we make it round the Horn. Oh, we'd be all right if we make it round the Horn. We'd be all right if we make it round the Horn, and we'll all hang on behind, and we'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along, and we'll all hang on behind. Oh, well, a night on the town wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, a night on the town wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, a night on the town wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all hang on behind, and we'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along. We'll roll the old chariot along, and we'll all hang on behind.